Divorces can get pretty ugly, and the NBA is no exception. Here are 10 superstars who forced their teams to trade them. Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain was the first NBA superstar to demand and orchestrate his own trade, and he did it in the era when players couldn't dictate their future, 20 years before unrestricted free agency even existed. You were with a certain team, and you were their property, and they had the option of keeping you or getting rid of you. Elgin Baylor, Wilt's Lakers teammate. At that time, contracts included a reserve clause, a standard provision that gave owners the right to retain their players after contracts expired, giving the players no say in whether they wanted to stay or leave. However, when the ABA League formed in 1967, NBA players finally had leverage. They could threaten to switch leagues if something wasn't to their liking. Wilt was also the biggest star in the league, and he had personal leverage of his own. After he finally won the championship in Philly, after 8 years of Celtics' reign, Wilt somehow convinced the 76ers owner to give him a one-year contract with no reserve clause, which he then used to become the first ever NBA free agent in 1968. Chamberlain then started calling other teams to tell them he was available, only because he wanted to start a bidding war to increase his salary, acting as his own agent. The Lakers ultimately traded for Wilt, giving away a few role players as token payment and sweetener for Wilt's deal, even though it was ultimately Wilt's choice where he would go and not the 76ers. Vince Carter. There's plenty to like about Vince Carter's career with the Toronto Raptors. Air Canada, as he was called, is single-handedly responsible for many Canadian players letting go of a hockey stick and buying their first basketball. After he won Rookie of the Year in 1999, he transformed the Raptors into a winning team and gave them the first taste of playoff success. He was arguably the fastest first step in the NBA, a smooth mid-range jumper, and his violent dunks were must-see TV, the purest exhibition of athletic poetry in motion. He was nicknamed half-man, half-amazing, but there was still a lot to dislike about his career with the Raptors. The first one was his trip to the graduation ceremony in North Carolina, which was due on the same date as the Raptors' Game 7 against Allen Iverson and the Sixers in the 2001 East Semis. Carter looked exhausted and missed the game winner that would send the Raptors to the next round, and many fans believed it was because he was too tired from that round trip to North Carolina. Another reason is that Carter never worked hard in the first part of his career, relying only on his talent and caring mostly about himself and his numbers. And the third, and most important reason, is the gruesome way he left Toronto. After the Raptors missed the playoffs in 03 and 04, Carter demanded a trade before the start of the next year. The Raptors didn't want to lose their franchise player, so Vince decided he would sabotage the team. Carter played zero defense. He dragged himself across the court and basically half-man, half-assed the last 20 games he played for the Raptors until he was finally traded to the Nets. When the trade came through, Vince immediately started dominating for the Nets, averaging 27 points, 6 rebounds, and 5 assists compared to 16 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists with the Raptors. Vince took a big proverbial dump on the entire organization and fan base, and from that moment on, he was booed every time he came back to Toronto. Anthony Davis. Anthony Davis was one of the most dominant college players of this century, and New Orleans had little to think about when they got the first pick of the 2012 NBA Draft. But during his 7 years in the Big Easy, the Pelicans and their GM Dell Demps had always managed to screw things up, putting together mediocre teams around AD and showing little ability to evaluate talent. Despite Davis being a perennial all-star, the team had a negative rating in 5 of Unibrow's 7 years, with only 1 playoff series win. It wasn't too hard to convince AD to leave, and once LeBron and their mutual agent Rich Paul began flirting with him to come to La La Land, Davis demanded to be traded. What was unique about this was Rich Paul publicly saying that AD wants to join the Lakers and Lakers only, and if any other teams trade for him, that AD would leave after his contract expired. Davis got fined $50,000 for publicly demanding a trade, and the Pelicans didn't let him play in games at first, and then the NBA forced them to play him because he was healthy. It was a soap opera that only NBA free agency could provide. To add insult to injury, Davis showed up for the final Pelicans home game wearing a t-shirt that read, "That's all, folks," a reference to Porky Pig's famous line. 2 months later, his wish came true, and he joined LeBron in Los Angeles, giving an end to this arduous saga. Kawhi Leonard. When the Spurs have a superstar player, they usually spend their entire career with the franchise. George Gervin played only his first 2 and the last year of his career outside of San Antonio. David Robinson, Tim Duncan, and Manu Ginobili played their entire career for the Spurs, and Tony Parker left only in his last NBA season. San Antonio and Coach Pop have always been known for Spurs culture, which was predicated on consistency, hard work, great values, and winning over personal stats. Kawhi Leonard embodied all those values, and after he won the Finals MVP in 2014, he became the franchise player, and everybody believed he would follow the beaten path and remain in San Antonio forever. But after the Spurs medical staff misjudged his knee injury and forced him to come back too soon, while he was still feeling discomfort, the relationship turned sour. Kawhi stopped all communication with the franchise and demanded to be traded. The Spurs had no other option than to oblige, and they sent him to Toronto, where Kawhi became a fun guy and a 2-time champion. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kareem came to the NBA in 1969, and in his second season, he already won an MVP award, an NBA championship, and was considered the best player in the league. After a close finals loss in 1974, the Bucks didn't even make the playoffs in 1975, and Kareem wasn't happy. It was partly because the team around him wasn't that good, and partly because he never felt comfortable in Milwaukee. Introverted Jabbar never really connected with the people, the audience, and the city itself. Before the end of the 75 season, he told the owners that he wanted to leave, and that his request was non-negotiable. He also told them he wanted to be traded to a big market that would satisfy his cultural needs, meaning either to the Knicks because New York was his hometown, or the Lakers because he enjoyed LA a lot during his college career at UCLA. The owners knew that once Kareem decided something, he couldn't be persuaded to change his mind, and after 6 years and 3 MVPs in Milwaukee, Kareem became a Laker. James Harden. The OKC ownership decided not to offer James Harden a maximum deal to save a few $1 million in luxury tax, not realizing Harden's true worth. Harden felt disrespected and demanded to be traded, so the Thunder shipped him to Houston. Of course, it was one of the worst trades in NBA history, as Harden became one of the best offensive players in history during his time with the Rockets. Houston made the playoffs every year when Harden was there, but they couldn't get over the hump and get out of the Western Conference, mainly because of the Warriors, who defeated them 3 times in the playoffs. History repeated itself, and the Rockets made multiple questionable trades to shed salary to avoid paying the luxury tax. And after they sacked head coach Mike D'Antoni, post yet another playoff disappointment. And after GM Daryl Morey left, it was time for Harden to go too. Just like Andy Dufresne in Shawshank Redemption, James decided he'd been there long enough. He demanded a trade, and after it didn't materialize initially, the Beard came into the season out of shape, sending a strong message to the new GM. After 8 painful games at the beginning of the 2021 season, he was finally traded to the Brooklyn Nets. Kyrie Irving. In 2019, Kyrie Irving said that the young guys on the Celtics don't realize what it takes to be a championship team, and that he called LeBron James and apologized for how he acted as a young player in Cleveland. Kyrie and LeBron were a great 1-2 punch that led the Cavaliers to 3 straight NBA Finals, delivering a legendary championship in 2016. But after 2017, Kyrie wanted to be the main guy and not the sidekick. He wanted to be Batman, not Robin, or Maverick, and not Goose. So he asked to be traded without even consulting LeBron. Even though there were still 2 years remaining on his deal, and the Cavs didn't have to trade him, they sent him to Boston. In retrospect, that was probably a mistake, especially because they didn't get much in return. Before we go into the final 3 names on the list, we have to give honorable mentions for a few other players. In the early 70s, Earl the Pearl Monroe forced his way out of Baltimore and into New York, where the Black Jesus helped the Knicks win their 2nd championship. Charles Barkley wanted to leave a bad 76ers team in 1992 and move to Phoenix, which is hypocritical considering how often he criticizes players that want to get traded. In recent memory, we had Eric Bledsoe, who tweeted, "I don't even want to be here," which earned him a fine from the Suns. After that, he hilariously backpedaled, saying he talked about his hair salon. He did get his wish and started getting haircuts in Milwaukee. Paul George demanded a trade from Indiana in 2017, and Jimmy Butler cursed his way out of Minnesota in 2019. Chris Paul. It took Chris Paul 3 seasons to become the best point guard in the NBA and be selected to the first All-NBA team. after he led the league in steals and assists, along with 21 efficient points. It took Chris Paul 6 years to realize that the team that drafted him, the New Orleans Hornets, as they were called then, weren't going to get any better. The Hornets only managed to win one playoff series during Paul's tenure, and he then decided he needed a change of scenery, despite 3 years remaining on his deal. He demanded a trade and got dealt to the Lakers, and then the NBA, led by the commissioner David Stern, famously vetoed that trade. Ultimately, Paul did land in LA, signing with the Clippers in the 2011 season. Carmelo Anthony. At the midpoint of the 2010-2011 NBA season, the New York Knicks played great basketball after developing a great core of players. At the same time, Carmelo Anthony was in the last year of his contract with the Nuggets, and he was anxious to get traded. In the trade saga that was known as melodrama, Anthony forced his way to New York before the trade deadline. By doing so, he destroyed the Knicks' core, which bit him and the Knicks in the ass in the long run. If they had waited half a year more, they could have had both Carmelo and a deep bench, and then maybe his stay in the Big Apple would have been a bit more successful. Dwight Howard. One season after Carmelo had his melodrama, Dwight Howard created one of his own. Dwight was the best center in the NBA for years at the time, a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, and the best player on a team that made the NBA Finals in 2009. But after feuding and ultimately getting his coach Stan Van Gundy fired, Dwight still wasn't happy. So the Magic traded him to Los Angeles in a big 4-team trade that made 11 players change their address.